Well, the relationship between South Africa and China has grown steadily over the years, developing into a mutually beneficial partnership. Total trade between the two countries has more than doubled in 4 years. CGTN's Angelo Coppola reports.
The relationship between the two countries is a little lopsided because of the huge difference in the size of the two economies. But it's moved to the next level when China adopted a different approach to its involvement in Africa.
South Africa was one of the places where China really started diversifying their engagement with Africa beyond issues around resource extraction. So the big investment in South African banking that already dates back quite a long while was a first sign that South Africa is going to be a place where China spreads the kinds of business that it does in Africa beyond simple resource business.
A sign of this close relationship is the strong bilateral treaty in place between the two countries. This treaty won't be affected by the recently signed Protection of Investment Act, which has targeted the relationship between South Africa, the EU member states and Switzerland.
I don't think China will be very impressed by this act and the regulations, but actually, because the bilateral investment treaty with China is still in effect, it's not going to affect Chinese investments in South Africa. What South Africa did was, in my view, rather inconsistent and we might say hypocritical. It maintained its bilateral investment treaties with China, Russia, Cuba, Argentina and all African countries that it signed bilateral investment treaties with, only terminated those with the European Union.
On a global level, China is taking a very distinctive leadership position since the US President Donald Trump took office.
And the interesting thing here is that China has really been, in the last couple of years, particularly since the Trump presidency, at the forefront of effective investment protection for Chinese investments around the world. So China's really very much led the field on effective investment protection, on recourse to international arbitration, on protecting investments against unfair and inequitable treatment, and has really encouraged developing countries to sign bilateral investment treaties.
China is definitely positioning itself as a champion of globalization. So obviously Chinese growth and Chinese development was helped a lot by globalization, and China is very interested in positioning itself as a kind of a key crossroads for global flows.
Analysts say that part of that approach was to develop a strong strategic relationship with South Africa.
South Africa is a key ally for China in Africa. One reason is that the South African economy is quite developed and multi-layered. So there's a lot more points of entry for engagement between different Chinese actors in South Africa. At the same time, the governments seem to be quite on the same page.
The relationship between China and other African countries is also based on bilateral treaties, although there is increasing engagement with the African Union.
We're seeing engagement with the AU is growing more and more. FOCAC itself is opening the space for this kind of wide platform where there's a lot of different relationships, but most of those still are bilateral relationships. And so I think Africa is going to have to be more proactive to set itself up as a bloc.
Economic ties between South Africa and China are solid and are expected to continue growing as the business people increasingly explore opportunities in both countries. I'm Angelo Coppola for CGTN in Sandton, South Africa.
And for more insight into China-South Africa ties, we're now joined by Dr. David Monyae. He's the co-director at the University of Johannesburg's Confucius Institute. Dr. Monyae, President Xi's visit marks 20 years of bilateral relations with South Africa. What impact has this had on the two nations?
The relationship between the two countries is deepening, and as we celebrate the 20th anniversary of the diplomatic relation, we see the relation going far beyond the Chinese Communist Party and the ruling party, ANC. It has gone in deeper into business community with a number of businesses taking place in both ways, 140 plus Chinese medium and large enterprises operating in South Africa, and quite a handful of South African companies in China. But I think we're going to see more in terms of strengthening. In the last state visit by President Xi, there was a 94,000 billion deal signed I think this time around we're expecting more in quite a number of areas, in tourism, in education, in key areas of collaboration, people to people, cultural, and I think one will expect more as build up to the second leg of his visit to South Africa, which is BRICS.
And as we've heard earlier, President Ramaphosa has set a target of raising $100 billion in investment during Xi's visit. What agreements are the two leaders likely to sign?
I think what we're going to see already, we have had a possible deal of 10 billion with one of South Africa's 9 provinces, which is Limpopo, which is going to sign a $10 billion investment with Chinese companies investing in Limpopo special economic zones. But I think this is just a small part. One will expect a much more concrete, tangible deals in specific areas, such as the ones that I've alluded to. Within tourism, there is more room for the sector to grow and employ more people. And mind you, South Africa's economy hasn't been doing well since 2008 with the global financial crisis. I think China is the biggest trading partner for South Africa. One is expect more of that 100 billion US dollars President Ramaphosa is looking for from international investors. Already has managed to get 20 billion from the Middle East. I think one will expect China to also invest more than smaller countries that President Ramaphosa has visited so far.
And finally, of course, President Xi's visit comes ahead of the BRICS summit in Johannesburg. As the smallest economy in the bloc, how could South Africa shape its engagement with other members to realize more benefits?
There are a number of key areas. I think what drives South Africa's national interests is to improve the high number of unemployment, particularly among its youth, and to ensure that it creates a favorable environment dealing with issues of corruption. Already President Ramaphosa has stabilized the situation in terms of dealing decisively with those perceptions of corruption. I think with the elections coming next year, there is going to be stability, and more of BRICS countries will definitely invest in South Africa, particularly in the infrastructure, far beyond South Africa, with also its region, the SADC region, and the continent in line with SADC as well as the AU Agenda 2063, in those key areas where massive number of our people will be employed.
All right, thank you very much for that, Dr. David Monyai, joining us live there from Johannesburg. He is the co-director of the University of Johannesburg Confucius Institute.